Cool. Welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 60, where we read and react to philosophy papers. This and every day brought to you by Corona. So let's see what we got. New journal articles. See if anything happened since this morning. What can no more artificial intelligence. Stop with the artificial intelligence. We looked at some of this stuff earlier. We looked at that one. This is from yesterday. Let's see. Did we look at all this? Yeah, we looked at a lot of this stuff. You know what we're going to do? We're just going to pull down like that and see, hey, Utilitas. Go look at this. See what's in Utilitas. Starting to look at everything already. Do fitting emotions tell us anything about well-being? Valuing human lives in two-level utilitarianism. Let's find out. Well, it's here. That's good enough for me. See. If you stop by live, and please do one day, you can get the link in the chat by typing !paper. You can get the paper. So hopefully this will actually be only 7 pages, or what passes for a short article. Well, this looks fine in length. As per usual, there's no guarantee on the quality of the philosophy. It's actually not been that bad. I don't think I've had anything like that was truly terrible. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Don't mean to cough right into the mic. Okay, do fitting emotions tell us anything about well-being? This review brought to you by Corona. Not sponsored by Corona, of course, but just brought to you by it. Kind of like Sesame Street was brought to you by the number 3. The number 3 did not sponsor it, but it was definitely important. Theories of well-being or welfare essentially aim to tell us which things are basically good and bad for us, or which things are basically constituents of our well-being and ill-being. Well-being and ill-being. I've never actually seen this locution, ill-being, before. I feel like I should have. According to some theories, all and only experiences of a certain kind can directly contribute to our well-being. No doubt the most popular such story is hedonism, which claims that all and only enjoyable experiences directly contribute to a subject's well-being, and all and only unpleasant experiences directly contribute to a subject's ill-being. So, while experiential theories like hedonism have been under attack for some time, this attack has recently become more pronounced. Oh, so sad. The problem for these theories is that they seem to predict that nothing external to a subject's experiences should have any direct influence on the subject's well-being. After all, if well-being consists in, for example, enjoyable experience, then facts about the person's life that do not directly impact their enjoyable or unpleasant experiences should be irrelevant to their well-being. Recently, however, it has been argued that facts of this kind can indeed directly impact the subject's well-being. One such argument has come from Tobias Fuchs, who appears to the following case. Imagine 2 women, both under the impression of being in a loving marriage. Their lives are identical, apart from the fact that one of them, call her Jess, has the right impression, while the other one, Ingrid, is mistaken. She is being lied to and cheated on by her husband. Excuse me. Theories like hedonism appear to imply that Jess and Ingrid should seem to us to be equally well off. That's because hedonism claims that well-being consists in a certain kind of experience, and Jess and Ingrid each have the same experiences. The theory therefore implies that the two have equal levels of well-being, and so the hope for the hedonist will no doubt be that our intuitions accord with this implication. The problem, of course, is that our intuitions about the cases not as hedonism. The problem, of course, is that our intuitions about the case are not as hedonism seems to predict. Jess intuitively seems better off than Ingrid. Since Jess seems better off than Ingrid merely in virtue of some fact about her life that does not directly impact her enjoyable experiences, the veracity of our intuition here seems to conflict with the truth of hedonism. And so either our intuition or hedonism must be given up. While this argument is simple enough, it is also quite powerful. It leaves the hedonist in the uncomfortable position of having to bite the bullet, either by suggesting that the intuition is for some reason misleading, or claiming that they themselves simply do not have the same intuition as many of us. Regardless of how plausible we take these potential responses of the hedonist to be, Fuchs has offered what he takes to be a principled argument against them. Indeed, Fuchs offers a working test for well-being, which aims to provide an independent standard for testing when exactly a subject's well-being has been impacted. The idea behind the test is that when we feel compassion for someone in virtue of some fact about them, and our compassion also meets a certain standard of correctness, when it is also the right sort of emotion to feel, the subject's well-being is negatively impacted in virtue of the fact about them. I'm just thinking about that example. They should feel the same for the most part, but I'd be very worried because if one of them, their boyfriend is cheating on them, then they are much more likely, they're in a much riskier situation. So wouldn't the hedonist not want to be in a risky situation about losing their happiness? I mean, that would seem to be a reasonable position. Maybe that makes no sense because it's potential, not an actual emotion. Okay, anyway. So since it seems right, for example, to feel for Ingrid in virtue of her being deceived. See, I don't care about the deception. It's just that it's a much riskier situation for Ingrid. The test apparently tells us that Ingrid is worse off in virtue of her being deceived. Given it reaches this conclusion by appealing only to facts about the correctness of compassion and not to any claims or intuitions about well-being, Fuchs' test seems to provide an independent and conclusive way of both testing for changes in well-being and refuting theories like hedonism. It's compassion test. Okay. My aim in this paper is to show that, in fact, tests of the sort Fuchs proposes can tell us little more than what we already know about well-being, and certainly not teach us that experiential theories are false. Fuchs' test and its significance. The general idea behind Fuchs' test, as I have said, is that if compassion meets some standard of correctness, if it is the right sort of emotion to feel, then we are free to conclude that the relevant subject is in some respect badly off. But what exactly is the relevant standard of correctness here that our compassion must meet? The standard of correctness here is the emotion's fittingness. Emotions are typically taken to have not only effective and motivational components, but evaluative components as well. To see this, consider fear. Fear is certainly marked by a certain effect, and also disposes those who feel it to perform certain actions. Yet fear also has an evaluative component. It involves apprehending the target of that fear, or the thing at which the fear is directed. Well, you can't have like some sort of existential dread that's like you're afraid but you don't know of what. A lot of horror movies like that, but we don't know what's coming. As instantiating a certain evaluative property, a property that's sometimes called the emotion's formal object. In the case of fear, the formal object is the property of being dangerous or being danger to the fearer, or being a danger to the fearer. This is evidenced by the fact that it would not make sense for me to feel fear if I did not take the target of that fear to be dangerous. If I did not experience a target as dangerous, there would be nothing to make my experience of fear intelligible. I don't know. Why not? I mean, I could be afraid of like say I have some phobia. I'm afraid of heights. I'm not afraid of heights, but say I'm afraid of heights. Okay, so the height is in some sense what I'm afraid of. I mean, actually, I'm not. My dad is afraid of heights, and so you ask him about it. It's like being high up is not a problem. It's some sort of interactive thing. I'm not sure that like being dangerous is really what the thing is, but he's got the phobia. In some sense, I feel like it's some sort of vertigo. You get this sense of like impending off an edge, and it has nothing to do with like actually falling down. Anyway, so like I'm not exactly sure why that would be dangerous. Okay, we can then say my emotion makes sense just in case I see the target as possessing the emotion's formal object. Importantly, however, Sochan's emotion can sometimes make sense even though we do not think the emotion is correct or fitting. If, for example, I know a nearby spider is harmless, yet I fear it just the same, we should say that although my emotion makes sense because I do see spiders as being dangerous, it is not correct or fitting because a spider is not, in fact, a danger to me. If in contrast, I am fearful of a nearby wild tiger, which I know is likely to attack me, my fear not only makes sense because I see the tiger as being dangerous, but is correct or fitting because the tiger is in fact a danger for me. And if you're in New York, you can catch COVID-19 from a tiger at the Bronx Zoo because one of the tigers has it now. I hope they have a ventilator at the zoo. I don't know. More generally, an emotion is fitting if and only if the target of the emotion is, in fact, has the property that serves as the emotion's formal object. I'm not entirely sold on this. I mean, it feels like you can define yourself into a situation where you have fear of you must have this formal object, but I don't know what the I mean, it just feels like that it's an arbitrary thing. You don't necessarily. Do you really need some object to be the bearer of the fear, or can't we just have like existential dread or of some sort that is amorphous in the target? It's like I'm afraid of the dark. I mean, the dark. I mean, what dark? Like the dark right over there, the dark behind me, like it just being generally dark. I'm not sure if I actually understand what is scary about the dark anymore. But like, if you're afraid of the dark, it's not like a shadow is freaking you out. It's some sort of something else. And so I'm not sure what the formal object would be in these sorts of things. But anyway, we'll see. Okay. I mean, it's fine to define things in that way, but I'm not sure what the motivation is. After outlining this notion of fittingness, Fuchs applies it to compassion. He knows that it does not make sense to feel compassion for someone whose life we take to be in all respects going well. Not make sense to feel compassion for someone. I mean, why can't you feel compassion for someone that's going well? Wouldn't you be happy for them? If, for instance, your friend was by all accounts happy, healthy, wise, and wealthy and wise, you may think it odd for me to report feeling compassion. I mean, you could be happy for your friend. Wouldn't that be a kind of compassion? Like, you feel great for the person. Like, wow, they're doing so well. I feel great for them. I feel good for being their friend. It's like, cool. Okay. If I told you that she will soon be diagnosed with serious illness, my compassion will seem perfectly in order. While this alone may not show that the property of being worse off is compassion's formal object, it at least suggests that a reduction in well-being is a necessary condition for compassion to be fitting. That is, it suggests that compassion's formal object, whatever it may be, must overlap with the property of being worse off, at least to the extent that, whenever it is instantiated, the property of being worse off is instantiated as well. So it looks like these folks have very different, have a slightly different worldview than I do. They have different meanings for all their terms. Because like compassion for somebody, it's like, yeah, they could feel bad, but you could have a compassion and be like, I want to join in with like their passions and the things that they want to do, and like I feel for like how motivated they are to like accomplish the things that they're doing. Seems like it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can feel for somebody else. Together with the outline notion of fittingness, this yields Fuchs' test for well-being. If compassion for some person A is fitting in virtue of A's having or lacking some property P, then A's well-being is negatively affected by A's having or lacking property P. Since an emotion is fitting if and only if its target in fact has the property that serves as its formal object, it follows, so long as the fittingness of compassion requires that the target has the property of being worse off, that if compassion is fitting in virtue of the target's having or lacking some property, then target of the compassion is worse off in virtue of having or lacking that property. The fittingness of compassion is then a sufficient condition for welfare having been diminished. Having established this test, Fuchs suggests a way of utilizing it. He writes, "We compare two lives similar in all respects, but that one has a property the other lacks. Now we see whether compassion is fitting towards one of them in virtue of having or lacking that property. If it is, we know that having or lacking that property is negatively affecting that person's well-being." The test then can be used to support our intuition that Ingrid is worse off than Jess. Since Ingrid is being cheated on by her husband and Jess is not, it follows, so long as Ingrid is the fitting target of compassion in virtue of being cheated on by her husband, that Ingrid is worse off than Jess in virtue of being cheated on by her husband. Consequently, it seems the fact that a subject is deceived can negatively impact the subject's well-being. As I've mentioned, Fuchs states his test to provide us with an independent standard for changes in well-being whose authority cannot simply be dismissed by those whose theoretical commitments clash with its implications. That's because fittingness tracks truth. An emotion's formal object must in fact be instantiated in order for the emotion to be fitting. Accordingly, so long as we establish that compassion will be fitting in some case, and that compassion's fittingness requires that its target in some regard badly off, the claim that the target of the compassion is nevertheless no worse off is not a response that it is available to the would-be objector. After all, by accepting that the compassion is fitting, we accept that the target is worse off. The verdicts of the test then cannot plausibly be refuted on grounds of conflicting theoretical commitments. Let me see if I reread that quick. Got distracted slightly. Let me establish. The claim that the target... No. Okay, yeah, so you can't... it's by definition, you got this. Okay. Now, that might be right, but notice how Fuchs actually applies this test. Okay, so... he's not going to do it the right way. It seems that compassion is fitting toward Ingrid in virtue of her spouse's cheating on her and deceiving her. If we overheard a conversation in a diner of someone telling his friend about his sister being in Ingrid's situation, and he expressed compassion for his sister, surely we would not find this unintelligible. The stranger's compassion is perfectly fitting here. According to our compassion test, it follows that the woman is badly off in virtue of her being deceived and cheated on by her spouse. Here, Fuchs appeals to the fact that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting, includes that on that basis that Ingrid is worse off. Notice, however, that the test says nothing about whether compassion seems fitting, only whether the compassion is fitting. To be sure, many of us will share Fuchs' intuition that compassion seems fitting, but this intuition does not tell us that compassion is in fact fitting. It tells us only that compassion seems fitting. And of course, it does not follow from the fact that compassion seems fitting that compassion is fitting. Given it does not follow from the fact that a subject seems to have some property that the subject has that property. And so it does not follow from Fuchs' argument that Ingrid's well-being is diminished. Okay, so like that we have an intuition about something, it does not make our intuition right in some sense. Like if you have you feel a certain way about that. Okay. The task for Fuchs, then, is to show that compassion for Ingrid is fitting. The problem here, however, is that we simply cannot know whether compassion for a subject is fitting without knowing whether the subject's well-being is diminished. To see why, return to the example of fear. In the case of the nearby tiger with COVID-19, we conclude that my fear is fitting because we know that the tiger is a threat to me and everyone else. And in the case of the nearby spider, we can conclude that my fear is not fitting because we know that the spider is not a threat to me and does not have COVID-19. But now consider a case where we're not sure whether the animal is a threat to me. Suppose there is a nearby dog which gives some reason to perceive it as a threat, say that it appears to be an aggressive breed, and which I therefore fear despite being unsure of how likely it is to attack. I see the dog as a threat. My emotion here surely makes sense. But is my emotion here also fitting? Well, of course, it depends. In particular, it depends on whether the dog is in fact a threat to me, and whether it is sufficiently likely to attack and harm me. If we do not know that it is in fact a threat to me, then we cannot conclude that my fear is fitting. The most we can conclude is that given the dog appears to be of an aggressive breed, there is at least one reason for thinking that my fear may be fitting. In the same way, I think the most we can conclude about Fuchs' case is that, given Ingrid appears to us to be worse off, there is at least one reason for thinking that compassion for her may be fitting. After all, whether compassion is fitting depends on whether the target's welfare is diminished, and so, in order to know whether compassion is for someone's fitting, we must know whether their welfare is diminished. Yet how could we know whether someone's welfare is diminished without the true theory of welfare? The answer outside any case where it is already indisputable that welfare is or is not diminished is that we cannot. If we do not already know whether a subject's well-being is diminished in some case, if it is not a case such as one being sustained and involving sustained and brutal torture, okay, seems over the top, but cool. Whether it cannot be plausibly denied that the subject's welfare is diminished, then we cannot presently know whether compassion of the subject is fitting. I mean, you could have just given them like a rash, man. Like, no one wants a rash. But because we do not know whether the subject's well-being is being diminished. This means that so long as we do not know well-being consistent, any case where we do not already know whether well-being is diminished will also be a case where we do not know whether compassion is fitting. And so, yeah, so if you rely on your intuitions, you have to assume your intuitions are perfect intuitions. And so, but to know that, you'd already have to have a theory of welfare. Or if conversely, you'd have to know a theory of welfare to know that your intuitions, how you feel about compassion, is likewise correct. And so there's no way to get out of this. And so, since we do not know what well-being consists in, since we do not already know in Fuchs' case whether Ingrid's well-being is diminished, it follows that we do not know whether compassion for her is fitting. We then cannot conclude that compassion for her is fitting, and so cannot employ Fuchs' test here. The most we can conclude is that, given Ingrid seems to us to be worse off, there is at least one reason for thinking that compassion for her may be fitting. Just in the case of my fear of the dog, we cannot know whether our emotion is fitting without knowing whether the target has the relevant property. It is worth briefly mentioning that this epistemological limitation will apply for analogous reasons to any emotion whose fittingness requires some change in the target's well-being. So long as we do not know either what well-being consists in or whether the target's well-being has been changed in the relevant way, we cannot know whether the emotion is fitting. I will return to this point below. Yeah, you can generalize on this. Importantly, in making this argument, I do not appeal to any kind of extreme skepticism. I do not appeal to any kind of extreme skepticism about what we can or do know about well-being. As I've suggested, I think there are at least some cases, such as those involving brutal torture, where we do know that a subject's well-being is diminished, despite our not knowing what well-being consists in. As it happens, I think these are also just the cases where we can surely utilize Fuchs' test. Since we know that welfare is being diminished, we can conclude that compassion is fitting, and so conclude that Fuchs' test that welfare is diminished. As this exercise shows, however, the cases where we can surely utilize this test are just those cases where the test is needed least. Since we cannot know whether compassion is fitting without knowing whether welfare is diminished, we cannot confidently apply Fuchs' test without already the very conclusion that the test is meant to help us reach. Seen in this way, Fuchs' test and its implications for the debate over the nature of well-being are likely to seem far less significant than Fuchs sometimes suggests them to be. At the very least, it seems clear that the test does not prove to us that experiential theories like hedonism are false, since the case that would allow the test to prove this are just those cases where we do not know whether compassion is fitting. Yeah, this is would beg the question. But even if that is right, it may be objected that this still provides some independent reason for rejecting these views. Well, if you can appeal to intuition, yeah, because then you're not appealing to hedonism, you're appealing to intuition. Like your intuition about when compassion is relevant. After all, in cases like Ingrid, many of us will agree that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting. And it may be argued, while this will not prove that the claim that compassion for Ingrid is fitting, it at least justifies the claim. It allows us to justifiably believe it, given our emotion does not seem subject to any defeaters, such as hallucinations or drunkenness. In that case, it seems we are also justified in claiming that Ingrid's welfare is diminished, since compassion is fitting only if a subject's welfare is diminished. The objection, then, is that even if Fuchs' test faces the epistemological limitation I discussed, the fact that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting still provides at least some reason for thinking that she is worse off, or so at least some reason for thinking that theories like hedonism are false. I mean, yeah, but I agree that relying on intuition would not be an experiential thing, and so, but there's probably ways out of it. As I suggested earlier, I think the fact that the husband is cheating would make it much more likely that Ingrid's happiness is on shakier grounds than her friend or whatever, the other couple. And in that case, like, it'd just be, seems like hedonists will, like, well, I'd prefer not to be on shaky ground. I just want more of the same experience, not a shaky experience. Anyway, I'm willing to concede that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting and compassion for Jess does not. Yeah, well, less compassion for Jess. Jess is doing great. I'm also willing to concede that this proves that for some reason for thinking that Ingrid is, or at least will be, worse off than Jess. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. What I am not willing to concede, though, is that any of this provides reason for thinking that hedonism is false. In fact, I think it is more likely to provide a reason for thinking that we have misidentified the property and virtue of which compassion for Ingrid seems fitting. Since Ingrid and Jess are in loving, happy marriages, being cheated on would almost certainly lead either of them to many very unpleasant experiences. But because Ingrid is only being cheated on, only Ingrid is overwhelmingly likely, hey, we got where I was going, well, to experience a great deal of unpleasantness in the future. As I see it, it seems far more plausible that in virtue of this fact that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting and compassion for Jess does not, then it seems plausible that being deceived or cheated on would explain this difference. Yeah, I agree. Perhaps you disagree. Nope, I do not. Then consider a slightly modified version of the case. Suppose Ingrid and Jess's marriages are not happy, and if either of them were to learn the partner's infidelity, it would not lead to any unpleasantness at all. It's like, oh, okay. It's like shocking. In fact, it would make them happy. They would see it as release and would eventually look back on it positively. Would compassion for Ingrid, whose partner is in fact cheating on her, seem fitting in this case? As I see it, while compassion might seem fitting in virtue of her being in an unhappy marriage, given the likely attendant unpleasantness, it would not seem fitting in virtue of her being deceived or cheated on. Since she would see it as relief upon finding out about the deception, it would not cause her to experience any immediate unpleasantness, and since she would look back on it positively, it would not cause her to experience any unpleasantness in the long term. Even if you disagree that compassion does not seem fitting in virtue of Ingrid's being deceived or cheated on, though, I'm confident you'll agree that it seems far less fitting in this case than it does when she is in a happy marriage. Yet in each case, she is equally cheated on and deceived, and so if these are indeed ultimately the properties in virtue of which compassion for her is fitting in one case, compassion for her should seem equally fitting in the other case. That is, if the fact that ultimately explains why compassion for Ingrid is fitting, and thus why she is worse off when her marriage is happy, is that she has a property of being deceived, then compassion for Ingrid should seem equally fitting when her marriage is not happy, because the fact applies to her just the same. Since compassion for Ingrid does not seem equally fitting in the cases, it seems considerably less plausible that this is ultimately the property in virtue of which compassion for her is fitting in either case. And if this is not the property in virtue of which compassion for Ingrid is fitting, then while the fact that compassion for Ingrid seems fitting and compassion for Jess does not, may provide some reason for thinking that Ingrid, or at least will be, worse off than Jess, that fact does not also provide reason for thinking that deception or something outside of Ingrid and Jess's experiences is what ultimately explains this difference in well-being. Contrary to the objector's suggestion, then, our intuitions about compassion's fittingness do not provide a reason for thinking experiential theories like hedonism are false. In fact, given the case where compassion for Ingrid seems more fitting also happens to be the one where she seems more likely to experience more unpleasantness, and the case where compassion for her seems less fitting also happens to be the one where she seems less likely to experience any unpleasantness. The hedonist and experientialist more generally seems particularly well positioned to plausibly explain why compassion seems more or less fitting in the cases. Yeah, since if she's already unhappy, then you don't have to feel compassion about her being lied to if that'll make her happy, so it can't be the lying. That would just go back to the general unhappy state of the marriage, which is already an experiential thing supporting the hedonist point of view. As my arguments here illustrate, our intuitions about compassion's fittingness are in no better position to tell us either when changes in well-being have occurred or which properties ultimately explain these changes than our everyday intuitions about changes in well-being. While these intuitions about compassion's fittingness may reinforce what our intuitions about changes in well-being can already tell us, we should be careful not to overstate their significance. They surely do not provide conclusive evidence of anything that would significantly advance the debate over the nature of well-being, such as the falsity of experiential theories, and indeed are just as likely to mislead us with respect to determining which things are basically good and bad for us as our everyday intuitions about changes in well-being. Accordingly, if our aim in this debate is to determine which things are basically good and bad for us, appealing to the fittingness of compassion does not seem an especially promising way forward. Really, these points apply to any putative test for well-being that appeals to the fittingness of an emotion whose fittingness requires some change in the target's welfare. That's because since fittingness tracks truth, we will be unable to conclude that any such emotion is fitting without knowing whether the target's well-being has been impacted in the relevant way, leaving us to retreat to our intuitions about whether the target's well-being has been so impacted, and thus about whether the emotion is fitting in any case where these things are not already known. Yeah, see, this is the crux of the argument, that to know fittingness tracks truth, but you'd have to already know what the truth is then about how they feel. While our intuitions here may provide some evidence for claiming the target's well-being have been impacted, they may also provide misleading evidence about the ultimate explanation for that impact. Since debate over the nature of well-being is essentially concerned with determining which things are basically good and bad for us, or determining which things are which ultimately explain changes in well-being, these tests therefore seem no better positioned to significantly advance the debate than appeals to our everyday intuitions about changes in well-being. I hope to have shown here that, while it may at times be tempting to think otherwise, significant progress in this debate still requires the difficult work of reasoning our way, via intuitions, to the true theory of well-being. Fitting emotions can provide no shortcut. Okay, that was fun. I don't know like this literature very well, or at all for that matter. So it seems like I agree with the author in some sense that tracking truth with some sort of truth tracking thing will not work, because you'd have to already know the truth about what you were talking about to begin with. So it's a neat little argument, like a sort of compact and like clean argument. What I mean by neat, not just saying like be aesthetically fun, but like it's a compact and like straightforward argument. So that was well done. I guess that's it for now. I hope everyone has a good day, stay safe, and avoid tigers, especially with coronavirus. Bye bye.